with this afternoon after Mike's input. So I won't say any more than that. I'm going to leave it now for Mike to lead off with his input, which I think will be really important because it's high. Concentrate closely on what Mike says because it may be important later on in the case study. I won't give too much more than that away.
Thank you, Simon. Just to let everyone know, the recording started now. So, Mike, over to you.
Thank you. And Deb and I are, of course, no relation, although we share a surname. I think that does need to be said.
Thanks for pointing that out, Mike.
There's no nepotism here or anything like that. I think this is the presentation. No, I'm sorry, this is the wrong presentation. Not doing very well. There we go. Oh no, sorry, I've put your slides up, Simon. I'm not doing very well today. Forgive me, folks. I'll get better. Right, here we go. Okay, folks, what I'm going to do is to look at learning about a very specific theme that emerges from the Safeguarding Adult Reviews that I have written over the last few years. And that is this theme of working with difficult to engage adults. And the starting point for this is the work that I did for Deb and for the SAB in Samwell on the Kim and Morgan thematic review, which I co-wrote with my colleague, Professor Michael Preston-Shute, who many of you will know is probably one of the leading British academics on this area of work. So that's my starting point, that's those SARs. But actually, as I've said, I've written SARs in many parts of the country, and again, this theme comes out again and again. But let's start with Kim and with Morgan. Both of them are in their ways very sad cases and very powerful cases. Kim probably the most sad and the most powerful of these. Kim was a woman who died at the age of 33 in hospital. She died of sepsis, but she had untreated abscesses on her body. She had quite serious problems with vision. She was underweight and in very poor physical tenancy. She had a tenancy which people had worked hard to get her, but actually most of her, most of the period under review, which was the last 2 years essentially of her life, she lived on the streets. She was also HIV positive. She was a sex worker, vulnerable to exploitation, assaulted by other people. She was a prolific Class A drug user, primarily a heroin user, and she had at times, for example, been sentenced to a drug rehabilitation requirement. There was self-neglect, self-discharge from hospitals with treatment incomplete. She talked about a very unhappy childhood, adverse childhood experiences, abuse, witnessing domestic violence. And in her turn, sadly, she had 3 children by the age of 25 or 26, and all 3 had been removed from her care by the time of her death. And on repeated occasions, she simply couldn't be found by people. She was in the borough, but people simply couldn't find her to access her. So Kim is a very sad case. Morgan is a 70-year-old man, was a 70-year-old man, long-standing history of heart problems, physical health problems, again, concerns about self-neglect, and within that, concerns about alcohol misuse. His flat is described as having beer cans everywhere, rubbish all over the floor, fire risk. Seemed to sit on just one chair with belongings strewn everywhere else. The classic kind of hoarding scenario. And at times, because he wasn't topping up his electricity meters, he was living in the cold, in the dark. There were care packages provided to him, and there were efforts from health and social care to support him. But he was often non-compliant with medication, non-compliant with carers, and there were real concerns about his frequent hospital admissions and the impact of poverty on him. He does seem to have had a significant alcohol problem. He'd twice been seriously assaulted by his son, sadly in the years before his death, and he had a tracheostomy due to throat cancer, and he died when that tracheostomy became blocked. So two very powerful cases, and there are similarities between the individuals involved: self-neglect, substance misuse. Within the thematic review, we look at things like the use of safeguarding, responses to their care and support needs and their health needs, concerns about mental capacity, the adequacy of multi-agency working. And I've put all these themes up here, but the one that I really want to highlight is the response to his non-engagement, or their non-engagement. And that's the one that I want to focus on, which is just one part of a multi-strand presentation. In many ways, however, non-engagement was the real challenge with both Kim and Morgan. There were lots of agencies involved with them. It wasn't that agencies weren't trying to do something, but often it can be very hard to engage them into constructive interventions. And it does raise all sorts of questions. How do we respond to repeated non-attendances, repeated disengagement? How do we respond to people leaving hospital with, for example, cannulas still hanging out of their arms? Is there sufficient outreach? Is there sufficient inreach to facilitate engagement with these complex clients? Are there escalation processes? And the theme that Simon mentioned is professional curiosity being used to try and understand what is going on. Now, those two individuals both had patterns of substance misuse, which is my expertise particularly, but we see that both in substance misusers and the non-substance misusers who are featuring in safeguarding adult reviews, there is often a challenge of engagement. How do we work with these people who are reluctant to engage, difficult to engage, challenging to engage? Choose your word for yourself. And this is a particular problem in our health and social care system. Now, when I was a young man, and that is now a very long time ago, I did social sciences and social work at university. And a book that was quite popular at the time was this book by a very famous British sociologist called Richard Titmuss. And this book is called The Gift Relationship. And actually, it was quite a bestseller. I have no idea why, because it was really about blood transfusion systems around the world, which is hardly the hot topic. But it was quite a famous book and was often recommended on kind of course lists and things like that. And what it looks at is blood transfusion as a metaphor for how healthcare systems work. And what it suggests is that in our kind of health system, what we have is a gift relationship in which health and social care is being given to people who need it. The problem is that in those kind of systems, those kind of social care systems, people who don't want to engage with what's offered pose a real problem. because it's based on the notion that people want this stuff. So it's going to be very difficult to know how to work with people who don't want to engage, but it is a reality. So we need to think about how to do it. And that's what I'm going to focus on in the time I've got. First thing to say is non-engagement comes in many forms. It's not about one thing. It can be about people who simply go missing, like Kim. People who are so chaotic that it's difficult to engage with them. People who, like Morgan was at times, are quite aggressive to people, or who agree to do things but never do it, the disguised compliance, or who are unwilling to engage with services, or who are being abused by others, coercion and control, cuckooing, which is preventing them from engaging. And of course, there are people who are apparently engaged, but actually are not moving forward. They're really non-compliant with what is being offered to them. And what do we do with those clients? How do we work with them? I mean, we have to say at the outset that prevention is certainly going to be better than cure. It would be better to prevent the development of these needs, and things like early help, trauma-aware, trauma-informed practice, public health prevention campaigns are going to be vital. And there's a lot to be learned from co-producing services with people who have experienced adverse experiences. But no matter how good our prevention is, there are always going to be people who are challenging to engage in services. And for them, we do need a good, broad approach, which at the heart has the center, as the person at the center of it, that there is good practice around from individual workers to that client. There's a good team around the worker and around the client. There's organizational support there. There's good policies. And actually, we need to make sure that law, governmental policy, financial situation is also supporting these individuals. Now, at the heart of the response is the need to identify them. And this is an incredibly simple statement, but it's actually really difficult to do and is the real stumbling block in many of these cases, that people are simply not flagged up as needing this more intensive response. These clients, people like Morgan, people like Kim, are very there, they're not hidden away. People know they're there, people are seeing them, but there isn't a mechanism for flagging them up as someone who needs more intensive intervention. And that's the starting point. We need to recognize that Kim or Morgan as someone who are going to need a more constructive, more structured, more assertive intervention. That may require having a specific referral point for these clients, having a specific multi-agency group, like within Sandwell, the Blue Light operational group that manages complex drinkers. But without that kind of recognised referral point, it's going to be hard to initiate a tailored intervention. We also need good attitudes and good beliefs. If we are going to help Kim and Morgan, then professionals and the agencies who manage those professionals need to believe that they should be doing something with this kind of client group, that they should be working with people who are challenging to engage. And that will be facilitated by recognising that useful interventions are possible. And you only have to cast your eye to the Blue Light operational group in Sandwell to see that we can do something with these very challenging clients. But if practitioners don't accept that they need to and should be working with these clients and that they can do useful things, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. People are going to be using old style approaches. He chooses not to engage, so there's nothing we can do. Or they're just unmotivated, or this is a lifestyle choice. We need to challenge those kind of beliefs. And we do need to make sure that we do some good work to understand what the client needs. It's very sad that often the time at which we understand people like Kim and Morgan's needs most clearly is after they've died. We do need to build up a good picture of living people's history, their backstory, what could work with them. We need to get a good chronology of what has been going on in their life. And having a clear chronology does support the development of better outcomes with these individuals. We need workers who are doing their homework on individuals, understanding how other professionals, for example, built a relationship with them. Information on what helps this client to engage needs to be transferred between services, along with all sorts of other information like their date of birth and their mother's maiden name, things like that. And we need to understand that this client group are not just being difficult, that they're very real barriers to these clients moving forward. Sometimes barriers due to things like fear. But often there will be more practical barriers. They may have brain injury, neurodiversity, learning disabilities, perhaps, for example, due to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, traumatic brain injury. Certainly, I think we're beginning to recognise, and Samwell have been doing work on this with us recently, that cognitive impairment is far more common than we understand. Traumatic brain injury is probably present in 50% of dependent drinkers and drug users. 70% of women in the prison system may have cognitive damage due to things like domestic violence. And even amongst men in the prison system, University of Exeter studies have suggested that somewhere in 60 to 70% of prisoners have got some sign of cognitive damage, traumatic brain injury. So this is very common and will be impacting on people's ability to engage. But equally, physical health can get in the way. Liver disease, pancreatitis, urinary tract infections can cause things like confusion. Liver disease can cause sleep disorders. And there may be other reasons why people don't sleep well, potentially because they're sleeping on the streets. And poor sleep increases cognitive damage and obviously makes you more tired, less motivated. Poor nutrition will have an impact here. And vitamin and mineral deficiency can directly affect cognition and motivation. And there may be practical problems about, are they concerned that they're smelly and dirty and people won't want to work with them? Is there peer pressure, family pressure, domestic abuse, cuckooing? But even more practical things like literacy problems, numeracy problems, financial problems, lack of a clock, watch, diary to remind them of what to do. And then there may be issues around stigma and prejudice. And this quotation here from an article in the Mental Health Law Review does suggest that, for example, substance misusers may receive less positive use of the Mental Capacity Act because people have kind of stereotypes of what they're going to be like. And so as Simon has said, and I won't dwell on this because I think Simon's going to talk about it more, but we said in the thematic review that workers do need professional curiosity to make sure that they are understanding what is going on with this client as best as they can. We need to think about what works with these clients. And first of all, I think you would expect me to, as an old social worker, to say that we need a person-centered approach that comprises proactive rather than reactive engagement, a detailed exploration of the person's wishes, feelings, views, experiences, needs and outcomes. We need to work to build motivation, a focus on people's hopes, fears, beliefs and the barriers to change. And you can see there, that's a quote from my colleague, Michael Preston Shute. So what works with these clients? I am quickly going to mention 12 things that work with this client group. First of all, we would advocate that within a care plan for this client group, there should be a specific engagement plan. We need to think through how you can keep the person engaged, and in particular, discuss with the client what you're going to do if they disengage. If you don't turn up for your next appointment, if you won't let me in next time, what do you want me to do? Can I ring you? Can I visit you again? Can I ring your sister? Is there somewhere I might find you? An engagement plan is vital. We need an approach which throughout promotes self-belief. Certainly in the substance misuse field, the best predictor that someone is going to change their drinking is that they believe they can change their drinking. And the best thing that you can do as a worker to promote self-belief is to show that you believe that someone can change. We need an approach based on motivational interviewing. Now, some of you will be familiar with this, some of you not. If you've had training in it, then use it. If you haven't had training in it, then I'd suggest getting it. And there is training available across the West Midlands on this, and it is very useful. Now, motivational interviewing was developed by these guys, Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick. And it's now widely used in all sorts of behaviour change settings, like smoking cessation, diet compliance. But it has its origins in the alcohol field. And what Bill and Steve identified was that often when people spoke to drinkers, they used techniques like nagging, persuading, confronting, challenging. And those approaches don't work with this client group. In fact, they tend to make people worse. They tend to entrench people in their defences. So what Miller and Rolnick always say is, you should roll with resistance. Okay, I understand you don't see your drinking as a problem. Let's find some other way of making your life better. And then motivational interviewing gives you techniques to focus on small changes that people can make. By making those small changes, you build up the self-confidence and the self-belief to make the bigger changes. So promote self-belief, use motivational interviewing, focus on small changes, build up their confidence to make bigger changes. At the heart of this, we need assertive outreach. And certainly in the alcohol field, the government is just about to publish guidance which says for these complex change-resistant clients, assertive outreach is the best evidenced intervention. And from the mental health field, for example, we have a long body of evidence suggesting that assertive outreach is useful with these clients. And the government is saying that it works with drinkers because we have evidence that it does, including evidence from Sandwell. It does beg the question, what is assertive outreach? It is an approach which is about going out to people, seeing them in their homes, in the community. It starts by focusing on building a relationship. focusing on what the client wants, seeing them as a whole person, not just as a consumer of drugs or alcohol or a hoarder or whatever they are. It's coordinated, it's multi-agency, it is persistent and consistent, and that it takes the time required. And the time required may be months, may even be a year or so to build that relationship and get the change occurring. But that's worth it, because many of these clients are amongst the most expensive in terms of resource usage that you're going to see in public services. We do need good relationship building. We need to think about our skills in relationship building, about empowering them. Building a rapport is the starting point. We need to think about reachable moments. We need to find points at which the person is more likely to engage with services. Moments of transition, moments of crisis. We obviously need to be trauma informed, and we need to recognise the impact that trauma can have on people, that adverse childhood experiences may have had, and that they may have had in childhood and may have later on in adult life. We need to be persistent and consistent, as I've said. We need family involvement where possible. That will not always be possible, and sometimes may be inappropriate. If you've got family members who are abusive or who need protection. But family involvement certainly does increase the likelihood of success in work with difficult to engage clients. If there isn't a family, we may need advocacy, someone to be the person's voice and to support them through the processes that they're required to engage with. We need to think about harm reduction. Ultimately, if we can't do anything else, we need to try and keep them safe. Food may be important here. Diet may be important. Managing their money effectively. Thinking about home safety. Are they smoking and dropping cigarettes in unsafe ways? Are there kind of fetid, verminous premises that they're living in? We need to think about harm reduction. And we also need to recognise that we have a very good body of evidence that bribery works with this client group. Public Health, NICE themselves have advocated with substance misusers that what they call contingency management, but essentially is bribery, giving people things to go to services, does work with complex clients like substance misusers. It's not always easy to give things like gifts and shopping vouchers, but other incentives such as clothing, food, travel costs, even things like complementary therapies have been shown to engage clients. And that kind of material does work. That kind of approach does work. Beyond those 12 things that work, we may at times need to escalate these cases. Workers will require good support and supervision, access to specialist advice on the Mental Capacity Act, the Mental Health Act, safeguarding, case oversight, agreed indicators of risk that say we need to do something more assertively with someone, good training in the skills we're talking about. And to work with this client group, we're going to need multi-agency meetings out there, which can manage these clients, like the Blue Light Operational Group in Sandwell, which is seen nationally as a model of good practice in kind of multi-agency management of complex clients. Multi-agency meetings don't work by magic. Simply getting people in a room doesn't necessarily mean that clients are going to be well managed. We do need multi-agency management, but we also need workers who can make the most use of multi-agency groups, who can understand their role, who are able to challenge others and to know when to escalate concerns. And ultimately, it may be worth thinking about a very senior multi-agency group. For example, one that's flagged up nationally a lot is the Creative Solutions Group in Plymouth. And this is a group that is the kind of ultimate point of recourse for very difficult, challenging clients. People are really struggling to work with can be escalated to this very senior management group for some kind of decision on how to move forward. And ultimately, we do need to think about the appropriate use of things like the Care Act, which I think does provide a good framework for focusing attention on difficult to engage clients and potentially for developing multi-agency management. Above all, we need to think about the Mental Capacity Act. And too often these clients are being pushed back and people are saying, oh, well, they've got capacity, without doing a real proper capacity assessment and understanding the impact on their capacity. And too often, I think even if the person genuinely does have capacity, that doesn't mean that intervention ends. This quotation from a review of the Mental Capacity Act says, the presumption of capacity is widely misunderstood by those involved in care. It is sometimes used to support non-intervention or poor care. That concern is echoed by workers all the time, that people are just being regarded as having capacity and nothing else is happening. But even if the person has capacity, the code of practice does acknowledge that there may be cause for concern if someone is repeatedly making unwise decisions, or making a particular unwise decision that is obviously out of character. Just because they have capacity doesn't mean they don't need ongoing support. And ultimately, we will need to think about things like the Mental Health Act, the Human Rights Act, antisocial behaviour powers, environmental health legislation, and even things like alcohol treatment requirements or drug rehabilitation requirements may be helpful. And that, folks, is the information that I want to provide you with. I'm going to come off the slides now and check whether anybody wants to ask anything or whether Simon wants to lead anything from this point onwards. Simon, over to you for a moment. Or are there any obvious questions that people want to ask? You're on mute, Simon, at the moment.
You'll do it now.
That's it. I'm unmuted now. No,
Good.
Thank you very much, Mike. And that covered a lot of ground that I think is going to be relevant in our case study, particularly around the assumptions about presumptions of capacity and using it almost as an excuse for not assessing capacity and self-neglect. So I think that's a great lead up, and it's certainly given me a lot of thought about engaging with hard to reach people. Debs, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Simon. Mine was more of an observation, really, in as much as you identified some key things that work, Mike, with a known population. So in terms of the one side that you identified, that was individuals who might be drug or alcohol dependent, but also some of those principles would work in many other scenarios too, wouldn't they? So I think it's an opportunity for people to think about how they might take that learning and use it in an appreciative way in different settings. So it's not to limit people's thinking, but to say, here's a range of things that we know work. And also, as I put in the chat, in terms of risk management, we do have vulnerable adults risk management in Samwell, and there are also opportunities to escalate through risk management panels
Okay, well, I'm gonna, if there's any more questions, Sonia, you'll see in the chat that Sonia has been adding, will be looking at the chat, and sometimes you'll hear Sonia, my partner in life and in work, chirping in on my microphone. She's off camera. We haven't found a way of getting us both on camera, but mental capacity is something we're going to talk about as we go through. So, we've mentioned, and Mike's mentioned, the fact that Sandwell have sadly had to conduct safeguarding adult reviews. And as a chair of safeguarding adult reviews, I think it's really important to understand that every review should be carried out with a huge, huge helping of humility. It's so easy with hindsight to look at what could have been done better, what should have been done better, what was the problem. But when you're in the thick of it, and believe me, over the years, I've found myself in the thick of it, it's not easy sometimes to see what the right path is. And so safeguarding adult reviews are not about judging or blaming. They happen when an adult with care and support needs dies or is seriously harmed, and they're undertaken when abuse or neglect is known or suspected to be a factor in the death. That includes, tragically, where people take their own life, and as Mike mentioned, increasingly involve people who are homeless, who are not supported, and whose needs are not being addressed or recognised even. And so they are very definitely about improving practice, not blaming or shaming anybody about their professional practice. And it's the old thing, reviews should make it easier for you to do things right than wrong in future. So it's about achieving positive change in our processes and the way we go about our work. And I want to make sure, if you've ever been part of a review because somebody you worked with died or suffered serious harm, I totally understand what a bleak and hard place that is for all professionals. So I want, in some respects, our learning this afternoon to help you be more effective in supporting your clients, but also to build your confidence in your practice and feel safe and secure about your personal practice as well. One of the most consistent findings in reviews is the lack of professional curiosity. And the minute I say it, I can almost hear an inward sigh as people go, oh no, here they go on, telling me I don't do my job right, telling me I don't investigate properly. Sometimes the lack of professional curiosity feels like something that blames the professional. I want to talk about professional curiosity as a way of feeling more secure about your job, more secure about your decision making, and actually having a massive benefit for the adults you work with, but importantly, for your own peace of mind and your ability to sleep at night, because it's your lack of time to do the things that make for professional curiosity that cause you the sleepless nights. I can't change funding problems. I can't change the fact you've got more work now than ever before with less people to back you up. But I genuinely believe professional curiosity will quite literally help you sleep better at nights because you'll feel more confident about your decision making. What is professional curiosity? Generally speaking, people tend to buy into that definition there, the communication skill that we need to explore and understand what's happening rather than making assumptions or accepting things at face value. When you're under pressure and your workload is increasing, it's very tempting to accept what you're being told as being reliable. And that could be one of the first problems you'll encounter, because there are lots of things that explain why we're not professionally curious, or that many people struggle to be. And they include things like resistant families. When a family doesn't want to engage, hasn't built a relationship with you, or doesn't trust you, it's going to be very hard to find out information that's reliable. And the work that you're going to have to do is going to be even greater. Mike mentioned disguised compliance. in a nutshell, disguised compliance is you being distracted by potentially positive change, like more regular attendance at a clinic. But what you're missing is that behind that, there's no real change in behaviours, and the risk to that family, to that adult, have not changed. So disguised compliance throws you off path. You're not to blame for that, but it's easy not to recognise it. None of us would be in the roles we are if we didn't believe that we could affect positive change by working with adults to achieve what they want in life. But we're also at risk of being professionally optimistic, hoping for the best and focusing on things that back up our hope without perhaps picking up on evidence that would demonstrate that things have changed. And confirmation bias is one of the biggest enemies of professional curiosity. You set down a path, you know what you think needs to happen, and you look for evidence that backs up that theory. The trouble is that can lead you to discount things that would really be suggesting, if you talked in a group with your colleagues, we should be changing tack, we should be moving down a different path. Confirmation bias is always a high risk. It's a high risk in reviews. Sometimes when you have a theory why something happened, you might miss things that are more pressing and obvious. But also, at the heart of our failure to be professionally curious is reflective practice and supervision. I genuinely think one of the most important things, if you're a first line manager for a team, one of the most important things you can do is supervise and discuss the case with your team and together come up with alternative perspectives to the case, because it's the lack of reflection, it's the lack of time to do that which makes such a problem. What is a lack of professional curiosity actually what's the result of it? Well, most importantly, it'll impact on the safety and support that families, adults we're working with are receiving. It's going to impact on our own professional performance, our ability to provide the right level of support and care, and it impacts on our confidence in our decision making as well. Importantly, it undermines the reputation of whatever organisation you work in, because if we're seen not to be effective, that's something we've got to try and rectify. If we don't hear the voices of adults and children, we're not thinking family, we're not understanding who supports that adult, who's their support network, which is crucial when we talk about pies, when we talk about that mnemonic, we're talking about their circle of support. If the risk isn't managed, if we are not identifying changes in risk, then we're not promoting the well-being of the adult, and bluntly, there's a risk they'll suffer harm or even tragically die. And every SAR is a tragedy, and often a tragedy of a failure to recognise what was happening in front of us. These people aren't hidden. As Mike said, they're not hidden. They're right in front of us. And that means that us as professionals, me, you, everybody else who was involved with that adult, feels responsible because they failed in their mind. They feel sometimes, however hard we try to avoid it, blamed. But they very often, those professionals, feel misunderstood. We haven't understood the context. You don't know what it was like to be dealing with that problem. And of course, the reputation of the organisation is harmed. So a lack of professional curiosity has ramifications for the individual, the professionals who worked with them, but also the organisations trying to support that adult. So what then is the solution? Well, there are many things that make sense. There are many things that you need to take into account. And first and foremost, be conscious of the fact your brain is split into two. You have the conscious brain that deals with the risks that immediately present, whereas your unconscious brain is driven by a huge capacity to process information. You've already had your unconscious brain recognizes patterns. When it meets a person, when you meet an individual, or you find yourself in situations without you realizing it, your brain is quickly assessing what you're dealing with and deciding how you should respond. And the truth is, often without conscious bias, you respond well to people who are like you. You have assigned risk to people. There's an affinity bias, a tendency to prefer people who are like you, who think like you, who agree with you. Knowing that you sometimes will have prejudgments and preconceived ideas about situations is really important, because it will help you understand when you should be saying, but am I right about how I've judged this situation? You need to know your limitations. We all do. As a professional, in situations, you don't choose the moment when a tricky situation comes to be one that you have to deal with. But you do need to stop sometimes and think, do I feel under pressure? Am I tired? Do I feel like I haven't got the experience to deal with this situation? Because if that's the case, that's the time your colleagues and managers should help you. That's when you need to be open and honest and say to your manager, I'm struggling with this. I'm not sure how to take this any further. I feel tense. It's making me anxious. We do want to be optimistic. We rightly should think the best of the adults we meet. But sometimes you need to think, why might somebody not be telling me the truth? Look, if you want to understand that, think about domestic abuse. Think about coercion and control. Think about the fact that somebody could be forcing the adult you're dealing with to tell you untruths, to hide what they believe. And it's so crucial. You need to consider that possibility that not everybody will tell the truth. You need to think about questioning your assumptions, being open to the thought your first impression may be wrong, and it's never too late to change direction. Be open-minded and triangulate. Gather information from multiple sources. Look at the information you've got and ask yourself whether it's reliable, and refine your understanding. Confirm or modify what you've already thought might be the case. This is about identifying what you know and you could be confident in evidence, what's unknown and what's uncertain. And we'll talk in a moment about that working with uncertainty. Perhaps one of the toughest things of all, and it's easy for me as a former police officer to talk about this and say you've got to be prepared to challenge. But not everybody feels comfortable with those challenging and difficult conversations with adults, which sometimes have to happen. Whilst I completely understand Mike's point about challenge is not the way to go with a change-resistant drinker, with an adult who might be not responding well, or with people who are giving you information that you may not feel is reliable, sometimes we can't shy away from those difficult conversations. And if you recognize yourself as somebody who has that issue, then it's worth trying to plan to actually identify how you can be more constructive in the way you talk and address those conversations. Now, some of you will have seen Jane Wonacott's discrepancy matrix, and this is a dumbing down, unfortunately, of that discrepancy matrix that Jane Wonacott suggested. But I like it because the what do I know? What's uncertain or unclear? What do I think I know? And what's missing is what is at the key of reflective practice. Okay, so the pale orange, the bottom box, is an example of the kind of situations you might face. So what do I know? That's proven and verified by more than one source. You've triangulated it. You are confident that it has some basis in evidence. And after all, that could also be the legal framework we're working within. That's what I know. Some of the information might not be properly understood. It might have more than one meaning, or people might hint at what they think the information means, but you've not got any firm evidence. The trouble is, views that are expressed have a danger, could become the truth. What I mean is they become something that is passed from one professional to another without us ever having checked out whether it was a reliable piece of information. It starts off orally. We talk about it. Somebody says something. Let me take an example. People will often talk about somebody's mental health condition as if there has been a diagnosis of that treatment, and we could point to that as an evidence-based assessment. They talk about them having a diagnosis of personality disorder, and it starts by being shared orally, and then it gets transferred onto somebody's case papers, and it's now become a truth. It's documented and it's further shared. And it's not until we say, what did we actually know to be true, that we recognize it might not be reliable. When you think you know something, recognize that your practice style, your built up experience will help you understand whether you can rely on what you've got. Your emotions and values impact, though, on how you react to situations and how you manage information. But what's really important in professional curiosity is understanding what's missing. Professional curiosity is about filling in the gaps. What more information do we need to reach a decision? And the last box in the bottom right, I think, is utterly crucial. All the models suggest the same thing. Being professionally curious is difficult. There are lots of things designed to stop you being professionally curious, like workloads, lack of funding, lack of support, lack of experience, lack of supervision. But the single most useful thing any of us can do, and I mean any of us, whether you're a senior manager or a frontline new to professional, is walk through the situation you're dealing with your peers, with your supervisors, and prompt them to challenge assumptions you appear to have made, identify what is firm and well-established evidence, and between you, identify what the gaps are. And that reflective practice, I think everybody would agree, is the single most important thing we can do to be professionally curious. So look, there's a very short resume of some of the challenges of professional curiosity. And I don't know, Deb or Mike or anybody else, I'll pause if anybody wants to raise their hand and add anything that they feel is relevant at this point, or add any observation. It's not compulsory, but I like to give people a chance to talk. Oh, hang on, let me just go. So I'm going to go to people so I can monitor. I think
monitor the meeting chat.
Oh, Melina.
Hi.
Don't forget to unmute, Melina.
Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you, Melina.
Okay, lovely.
Hang on, I'm not hearing Melina. Go ahead, Melina.
As a social worker, I just wanted to touch up on what you mentioned about what is uncertain or unclear. So as a social worker in the MASH team, there are times we receive referrals raising concerns around a parent's mental health. And actually, when you're digging further, it's unclear as to what diagnosis they have, or even if there is a diagnosis. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. It's really important.
Yeah, look, I think it's probably the most consistent thing I've noticed in SARS is that a person's mental health, we all have views on it and we'll attach labels, but often they're not reliable labels. They're not backed up by evidence. And that's, I think, very important, Melina. So I'm glad you agree, because that causes us anxiety all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's times where it's just what the adults shared to that professional. However,
Yeah.
it's not been clarified by a mental health practitioner if there is an actual diagnosis. So it's the
Yes.
parent that may think they're suffering from X, Y, and Z, but in
Yeah.
truth, there's no diagnosis there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why record keeping, defensible decision making in practice requires us to record what we think the information is and what its source is. So this is not a formal diagnosis. This is the opinion of the family, which is very important to undertake. But do they actually know what the signs are of psychosis, for example? So it's very important. There's no problem sharing information, but make sure you attribute the source and its reliability and assess that, which is really important. So look, we're going to use a case study later on after the break to try and illustrate some of this. And I hope, Melina and others, you'll feel inclined to join in that conversation. But I am going to go over some of the key principles around the Care Act for safeguarding, because there isn't a safeguarding policy document or adult safeguarding policy document anywhere in the country that doesn't highlight the principles behind safeguarding decision making and making safeguarding personal. And I think sometimes it's worth everybody being reminded what the Care Act says. Because if we're going to safeguard an adult, in its wider sense, it means protecting that adult's right to live in safety, free from abuse and neglect. But it's about us working together to prevent that risk and experience of abuse and neglect, but at the same time, making sure the adult's well-being is being promoted. And this is the important bit, folks. It's all about understanding what they feel about the safeguarding concern, what they want to happen, what they think is the right course. So there is a degree of frustration for the paternalistic amongst us who feel that they want to intervene with an adult who has capacity, who perhaps makes choices that you don't agree with. That's their right. That's what safeguarding is about, protecting the adult's right to make choices. But we also need to recognize when their ability to make those choices may be influenced by threats or coercion or anything that is meaning we're not hearing their voice. So hearing the voice of the adult is every bit as complex as the voice of the child, which we've heard mentioned so many times. Because at the heart of all this is MSP. Now, for social workers, for people like Melina, MSP is something they have to reflect on in their practice on a daily basis. But every one of us should be thinking our safeguarding decisions are about making it personal for that adult, because it's a culture shift. The Care Act brought in a culture shift in practice and in culture, because it was about having conversations with people about how we can respond to safeguarding situations in a way that enhances their involvement. They're at the centre of this, gives them choice and control over what's going to improve their life, their well-being, and importantly, their safety. And this is the line I like best in all of this. It's about seeing those adults we work with as experts in their own lives and work with them, not imposing solutions on them. And it's a shift from a process supported by conversations to a series of conversations supported by a process. So look, the message is clear. At the earliest opportunity, and we're going to meet a lady called Edith. As soon as we can with Edith later on, we want to find out what she thinks about our anxieties and worries for her. So that conversation has to happen straight away. And that's empowerment, people being supported to make their own decisions. Now, the Care Act, some of you will know, has got guidance, and the guidance tells us what the adult themselves should be feeling about this. And so Edith will be saying, and this lady should be saying, I'm consulted about the outcomes I want from the safeguarding process. They directly inform what happens. Now, I feel a bit embarrassed here, giving you my perspective on how to discuss a safeguarding concern when I've got a room full of social workers and social work managers. But look, for me, there are 3 stages that I would always follow. The first is, before I jumped into discussing the safeguarding concern, I'd say, Edith, who understands your life at the moment? Who supports you? Who's around for you, helping you with your health needs and care? Then you'll understand the role of the carers, the role of her family, the role of her friends and everybody else. And importantly, you'll recognise people who could be called on to help Edith to build that circle of support if she agrees with sharing information. Then I would ask her, if anybody can't see slides, I'm hoping you're all seeing a slide at the moment with empowerment. If you're not, leave the session and rejoin. Sometimes it's a thing about bandwidth. I'm hoping, can we have a few thumbs up, if provided everybody can see? If yeah, that's great. Okay, I'm assuming everybody, because there's thumbs everywhere. I've never had 50 thumbs before. That's so cool. Okay, that's great, folks. Thank you, Felicita. Okay, then I would always try and talk about what the concern is, but I would dive in and say, I'm very worried, Edith, because I would strongly advocate saying, is there anything at the moment that is impacting on your sense of well-being, anything that makes you feel anxious, even a little scared? That would give Edith the chance to lead the discussion about the safeguarding concern by describing what it is. But if she doesn't, you may have to explain what your concern is. And the final stage that I would advocate to get a proper understanding is, what support, Edith, would you like us to try and put in place that would make you feel better able to cope? After all, the support that Edith gets has to be one that she's happy with, that she wants to be involved with. So what support would you like us to try and put in place that would make you feel better able to cope? I think is a good question to identify that. Does anybody with much more experience of adult safeguarding want to comment on that empowerment, that conversation, which should happen in almost every case? The only time it might not is when you think that the act of having that conversation with Edith could put her at risk of greater harm. So it could actually mean that perhaps somebody who's abusing her recognizes that she's disclosed to you. So if it would put her at risk of harm, you may have to make decisions. But the conversation at the start of the process early on is key. Anybody like to ask anything or add anything at that point? Okay. You'll know that the second principle is prevention, and it's about helping people understand that what they're experiencing could be abuse. Imagine this young guy has lived all his life with being ridiculed or bullied by the very people he should be relying on for support. He needs to understand that that's unacceptable, that he shouldn't have to accept it. He should be given the confidence to decide how to report it, when to report it, and who to seek help from. It's about empowering him to make choices for himself whilst backing him up in his decision making. It's not just people with care and support who don't recognise that they may be victims of abuse. As a police officer, I have heard so many women in the past say to me things like, I'm not like those poor women that you hear about who get beaten or even killed by their partner. He doesn't do that, but he tells me who I can see. He calls me horrible names and I don't understand why he feels the need to do it. He won't let me see my family sometimes. And you need to gently describe to that adult, that's domestic abuse, just like physical abuse. It's exactly the same. So it's not just people with care and support needs who don't always recognise and know how to prevent harm. When we talk about safeguarding solutions for Edith later today, we need to recognise that the whole point of decision making is that we respond to what the adult wants and find the least intrusive response to the risk presented. At the heart of adult safeguarding, and every local authority area will have a position statement where they talk about positive risk taking. This isn't a paternalistic, we'll do everything we can to cotton wool an adult from risk. Positive risk taking is recognizing that adults may choose to run a level of risk because it makes them feel they're still in control of their life. If we try and remove all risk, we remove control over their life as well. Care homes spend a lot of time looking at what positive risk management would look like for adults with cognitive decline who might be able to continue life for as long as possible independently. Debs, I don't know if you want to come in on positive risk taking in safeguarding decision making, just to give us some flavour.
Thanks, Di. I'm always ready to come in on anything, frankly, as most people on the call will know. So it's about balancing that autonomy, choice and control, enabling and empowering individuals against our duty to safeguard. And that's not an easy balance, but that's really, for me, that's the nub of adult safeguarding. And for me, that's why, it makes it such a challenge and such an interesting, positive field of work. And as you say, if we remove people's choice and control, then actually how are we enabling people's lives to be better in simple terms? Because our challenge isn't just about ensuring people are safeguarded, but also it's about ensuring that we add something, isn't it, to people's lives, so there's quality in those.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deb. Yeah. So look, you are not failing to protect an adult when you feel that they're taking on more risk than you think is wise, because you remember they're experts in their own lives and often their decision making is really important. If you're going to report with the adult's consent a safeguarding concern and you're going to share it with the local authority, you need to understand the process. You need to understand to be able to explain to that adult what support is going to, and you need to make it clear to them. They hold the brakes, they hold the accelerator. They can actually make the decisions that influence what's going to happen. Not me, not you, them. And so that is crucial. And it's an ability to explain to them in simple terms. You may have been involved in dozens of safeguarding inquiries. Chances are this adult's never been involved in a safeguarding response. So they need to understand what support's going to be available to them. And I've actually moved the order. The last of the principles is accountability. It's really important that we all explain in simple terms what our job role is, what we can and can't offer an adult who may have a safeguarding problem, and be open and honest about what we will keep confidential, what we might need to share, how we can help, and not promise the unachievable. The fifth principle, which I've moved to the last, is partnership. Look, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're the most confident social worker, police officer, housing officer, you cannot solve a safeguarding issue on your own generally. So the adult will need to be confident that we share information appropriately and we take into account their wishes. I'm confident that information will be appropriately shared in a way that takes into account its personal and sensitive nature. I'm confident agencies work together to find the most effective response to my situation. So I'm going to now, for the next few minutes, talk about information sharing, and I do it with a tightening in my chest because I think this is the nightmare part of the whole adult safeguarding decision-making process. What should and shouldn't I share? When am I going to do it wrong? When am I going to do it right? Well, there's a simple starting position. Build a relationship with adults, and generally they won't decline your right to share, to get the help they want. Most of the time, you'll get their absolute consent. So the problem is not going to be there. If they don't want you to share information with another agency, so if, for example, you're in health, discussing a safeguarding concern across health is part of the care the adult has signed up for, and that's completely normal. But you need to know, what do I do when I need to share outside of the organisation? And when you're in doubt, always, wherever you work, talk to a safeguarding lead and to your manager, and where time allows, get a second opinion. So if you believe you have to share information and you're not sure whether you should, but always record how you reach your decisions. Okay? Now, I'm going to say something which I believe quite strongly. I read a lot of safeguarding adult reviews, domestic homicide reviews, for that matter, child safeguarding reviews as well over the years. I don't think I've ever seen an adult safeguarding review that said the reason this adult suffered serious harm or death was we shared too much information about them. If there's been one, I'd love to see it. Because whether it's Mike's review, my review, or anybody else's, the conclusion we often reach is the adult suffered serious harm or even death, partly because we failed to understand the full picture. We failed to share with other professionals our understanding of what was going on. Follow that through, and excessive anxieties about information sharing are likely to harm, not help adults. Debs, I always stop here. Deb or Mike, do you want to put a different perspective there, or would you say the same? Or Deb?
I would say the same, Deb, just in case anyone's not clear. And I would say in addition that if we have reasonable belief that a person is at risk of harm, then we have to share that information in order to safeguard or protect that individual.
Yeah.
I think the key is being clear about your rationale. So in terms of defensible decision making, it's being clear about on what basis you chose to do what you did and recording that.
Absolutely. It's about defensible decision making. Nobody will criticize you if you share information in good faith to prevent harm to an adult or serious harm to an adult. Nobody will criticize you if, with hindsight, the conclusion is we potentially shared too much. Remember, even Caldecott guidance, which talks about the sensitive personal data in health records, the 7th principle says clearly the duty to share information can be as important as maintaining patient confidentiality. Now, as well as NICE, the go-to place that I would go to for adult safeguarding information is SCI, the Social Care Institute for Excellence. I don't think there's an adult safeguarding policy document anywhere that doesn't include the very sound reasons why information sharing is crucial that SCI come up with. The list almost has a kind of outlier nestled in amongst them. There is a duty to prevent serious harm or death, which trumps confidentiality in many respects. Where somebody is at risk of serious harm or death, your right to a private life under the European Convention, the European Conventions, is trumped by the need for us to prevent death or serious harm. So I don't think many people would hesitate to share if they thought a client was at risk of serious harm or death, regardless of whether they consented. And that clearly would be a decision properly taken. But look at all the other reasons that SCI says require us to share information about safeguarding, to coordinate our responses, to enable early interventions, to prevent the risk escalating. If somebody's got care and support needs, if we don't recognise the risks from abuse and harm, they're going to need more support. It's good practice in adult safeguarding to share concerns about safeguarding risk, because it will reveal patterns of abuse that were undetected, which could identify there are other people at risk. They say we should be identifying low-level concerns that may reveal people at risk of abuse. And it promotes welfare, which is the key. The well-being principles are the first thing the Care Act talks about. That's our driver to promote the well-being of adults. And of course, it could identify people who pose a risk, and it could prevent criminal activity. And last, and in no respects least, it prevents a risk to your organisation and their professional reputation, and to you, that professional curiosity risk I talked about. Okay. We do need to be confident, though, about sharing without consent. 99% of the time, we will get consent to share, and this will not be a problem. But there are circumstances when we would have to override the duty to the adult's right to choose. There will also be occasions when we will need to share without even having had that empowerment, that conversation we had at the start. And that's where the substantial public interest comes into play, reporting without consent. And this is, we hear this mentioned a lot, but its foundation is within data protection. Schedule 1, Part 1, Paragraph 18 of data protection. So there is a substantial public interest in sharing information, even sensitive data, health records, to protect individuals from neglect or physical, mental, or emotional harm, or protect the physical, mental, emotional well-being of an individual. Okay, that's the substantial public interest. And it comes into play if the adult you're working with is over 18 and at risk. Okay. This may mean that it will be appropriate to share without their consent, because there's a substantial public interest it should happen. Now, you will probably recognise this sentence here as being in the safeguarding guidance, the point at which you should be making a referral, where you've got reasonable cause to suspect an adult with care and support needs is at risk of abuse or neglect and is unable to protect themselves. That is at risk. Can I pause here and just make one important point? And it's not helped by the fact it says an adult with care and support needs. Do not imagine that the criteria for making a safeguarding referral is care and support needs have already been assessed and identified. The guidance says an adult with care and support needs, whether or not they're currently being met by the local authority, because the Care Act guidance actually says you make a safeguarding report for an adult with care and support needs, who could be, and they give examples, some elderly people, some people with physical health conditions or mental ill health, or adults with alcohol or drug misuse who cannot meet their day-to-day living, the outcomes of the Care Act. It doesn't say you have to demonstrate that they can't meet 2 or more of the outcomes, which is the eligibility criteria. So safeguarding referrals don't need the eligibility criteria to be met. And I think there's growing consensus that it is unrealistic to expect you to be certain at this early stage that an adult's unable to protect themselves. So the general consensus from the AD Association of Directors of Social Care is you need to be comfortable that they have some form of care and support and they're at risk of abuse or neglect. The safeguarding investigation may identify whether they're unable to protect themselves, and that could take a while. Any questions on anything I've said so far? So
let me just say, Simon, I'm sorry, I've had some tech problems, so I haven't been.
don't worry.
If you'd like, but I think your summary is excellent. I think I couldn't disagree with a single word you said.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. So look, there are circumstances when we may have to refer without even seeking consent from Edith or anybody else. That's where they're unable to give consent. They could be under coercion and duress. They could be physically ill and unable to give consent. It may not be possible for you to get that consent. I think it may be not possible for you to get that consent. Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, look, it's really important to understand care and support needs, the eligibility for them is not the same as having care and support needs which require a safeguarding response. We might find out they have full care and support needs which need actual provision, but it isn't the reason why you make a referral. It's because they're elderly, they're vulnerable, they have needs that are not yet being met, and they're at risk of abuse and neglect. Being unable to protect themselves is what you suspect, but you certainly don't need to be able to prove it to make a safeguarding referral. If they can't give their consent, or you can't be expected to obtain their consent because it's not practical, or they have perhaps been moved by an abuser and you can't find their address, perhaps only the police or social care will be able to do that. And very importantly, if you think it would put any level of risk to get that initial conversation carried out with the adult, so most likely the perpetrator is going to punish them for daring to talk to you, or might remove them from the area or remove them from sight. And finally, although it's not part of data protection, I think it's generally accepted that if you think that evidence of a crime, most likely against that adult, would be lost if you talk to her or him about your concern. So the perpetrator is going to find out and hide the scene of crime, hide the fact that they've carried out a theft, perhaps bully the adult into not giving evidence. Anything that could contaminate evidence is another good reason to share the concern with social care without having had that initial conversation with our adult. Okay? So look, that's whenever you see the reporting without consent, it comes from Data Protection Schedule 1, Part 1, Para 18. And if you want to look it up, it's there. And it applies for children as well. So remember, that's the reason you can share information without consent for children as well. You get to the end of the 3 stages. Do you remember I said, what support do you have? Is there something making you feel anxious or worried? The safeguarding concern. You've got a joint understanding now of that concern, and you get to the 3rd stage where you say to the adult, what support would you like us to try and put in place? What support would you like us to try and put in place that would make you feel better able to cope? Now, most times the adult will say, I'd like you to do this. I'd like this to happen. What do you think? And you could give them advice. But what if they get to that, you get to that bit of the conversation and they say, I don't want anything happen. I don't want, and Edith's going to be like that later. I don't want you to do anything. At that point, I would strongly suggest talk to your manager, talk to a safeguarding lead, discuss your concerns. Remember, if you together can't come up with a solution and you want advice, there is nothing. In fact, it's good practice to contact social care and you can discuss in the hypothetical. I have an elderly patient of 80 who's got rheumatoid arthritis. She's got this problem, that problem. We believe she's at risk, but she doesn't want to accept help. What should we do? Is there any advice? And they may ask for the specifics of that individual so they can check out the concern. Remember, you're not the only people who might put in a referral. plenty of families and adults will share their concerns to social care. They're not fully appraised of information sharing rules. They're just sharing their concern and social care are acting on it. Okay. So there are situations that, and these aren't an exhaustive list, but they're situations where you may have to override a refusal to share. If you're in that situation, I would follow the path that are in this orange circle. Start off by saying, why are you reluctant to share information? Would you mind explaining to me why you're anxious about me sharing information about this concern? Now, it could be that they've had a bad experience in the past. They haven't yet trusted you as a professional. They are under pressure or coercion. There could be any number of reasons why they're reluctant for you to share that information. But by asking why, you may identify the blockage, and the adult might then consent to the sharing of appropriate levels of information. If that isn't successful, explain who you'd like to share with and why them. I need to share with this team at this agency. Nobody else, just them. This is what I think the benefit will be. So, Edith, this is what I think would accrue if we could share with them and get help from them. But I'm worried that if we don't, this is the consequence of not sharing. This is what risk I think you're running, and it's a risk I think could increase. If those 4 stages have not built the confidence of that adult, then you will need to explain what you think the overriding reason is that would allow you to share without their consent and help them to understand it. But most importantly, you may have burnt a few bridges by making that decision. It's a difficult conversation, but it's one you've got to have. But you need to assure the adult you're still part of the safeguarding process, will be there to help you along the way and explain what's going on. So, look, the list that is in West Midlands Adult Safeguarding Policy document says you could share information where the adult lacks capacity. Now, that doesn't mean because you've established they lack capacity for the choice that you would necessarily share, but it's a decision you could take. Where other people are at risk of harm, and that includes children, you may need to override their refusal to share information to prevent harm to other people. If it's a child, I would suggest where the safety and well-being of a child are at risk from the adult safeguarding concern you've discovered, you should be making a referral to Children's Trust. You should be assuring the adult that that does not mean that the social care team at Children's Services will come pounding in without reflecting on risk. But you should not rely on other people to do it. Where a child's at risk of harm, you should be proactive in sharing that concern. A lot of the people you work with may be living with another adult who themselves has care and support needs. If the pressure on them from their own care and support needs has become so intense that they have become neglectful or abusive or domestically abusive or physically violent, if we don't share to get them support, the risk will not reduce. And more importantly, somebody else with care and support needs will have their needs not met. So that could be a reason. Similarly, where there are staff implicated, so if a carer is accused of having abused an adult, if a member of your team are accused, you must share with your manager, and your manager will speak to a senior manager who will independently discuss the concerns and the allegations against the staff member with the local authority so that a designated person can assess its implications. That doesn't mean your manager may not end up investigating the allegation against a member of staff, but it has to go through the proper channels. You can share information to prevent crime. There is a common law duty to prevent crime. Somewhat confusingly, the General Medical Council and Sky talk about preventing serious crime. The West Midlands Adult Safeguarding Policy document says preventing crime, any crime. You would be sharing in good faith, prevent crime. I'm not going to dwell on the distinction, but everybody agrees once the crime has been committed, it should be a serious crime in order to override an adult's refusal to share. That doesn't help much because there's no definition of serious crime, but you would need to discuss with the manager to identify whether, in your view, the crime is so serious that regardless of what the victim says, we should be sharing that concern with the police. Coercion and duress. This has two meanings. Within domestic abuse, I think it's a staggering 95% of all victims of domestic abuse describe elements of coercion and duress by the abuser, preventing them make decisions or choices for themselves. Coercion and duress is about removing from a victim their scope for decision making. Where there's coercion and duress by an intimate partner or former intimate partner or family member, if an adult has care and support needs, that coercion and duress is part of domestic violence. It's a crime. So it's an ongoing crime, and you may conclude we should be sharing with social care our concern because this is an ongoing crime. Yeah. But there is a further strand to coercion and duress, which is well worth knowing, and it's the inherent jurisdiction of the High Court. The High Court, Court of Protection, who normally deal with adults who have care and support needs, they are entitled to act where an adult with care and support needs who has capacity is subject to coercion and duress by somebody other than a family member or intimate partner. Remember, if it were a family member or intimate partner, it would be covered by domestic abuse legislation. But this could be a third party bullying or coercing your adult into not reporting concerns to social care, not engaging with healthcare, for example. So the inherent jurisdiction of the High Court is really, really important to understand. And it relates to adults with care and support needs who have capacity, but are being subject to coercion and duress by somebody other than an intimate partner or family member. Okay? When somebody is discussed at MARAC, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference for Domestic Abuse, they have been assessed by a multi-agency team as at the highest levels of risk. That means they're at risk of serious harm or death. Remember, we said that common law duty to prevent serious harm or death trumps confidentiality, and it is appropriate to share confidential information if necessary with MARAC following the information sharing rules because of the high level of risk. So that's another reason why you might override a refusal. And finally, a court order or legal authority requires that information. So those are the generally agreed reasons why it would be appropriate to override a refusal to share information because of the risk levels to people other than the individual. But remember, where an adult chooses not to have information shared about your concern, that's when the team work together to identify whether we've met the risks and we've identified those risks. Has anybody got any questions at this point? I can see poor Mike is still struggling with his IT, but has anybody got any questions about anything we've said? Anything at all? Okay, so look, we talked about how it should work. We've talked about information sharing and the principles behind it. We're going to take a break now for 15 minutes to give you a chance to get some refreshment. And then we'll go into a case study where we will try and identify from a case study based on SARS how we should respond. So it's just gone 22. So can we all regroup by no later than 5-2? And from here on in, the session will stand or fall on your willingness to ask questions, make points, share perceptions. So this is where we hopefully will have the kind of conversations Deb talked about. Okay, so let's take a breather and don't log off, but make sure your microphone's on mute so we don't hear your private conversation. And we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thanks very much.
No, just talk to Mike.
Mike, are you still struggling?
I am. I can't.